How much would you spend on turbos that make 1,000 horsepower? Would you believe only 326 bucks? That's cheap. Let's put them to the test. In this video, I ran a pair of eBay DNA GT45 turbos on our big block Chevy, the Gen 6 454. Now previously I'd run a single turbo. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. It's right here. Predictably, one of these turbos was a little small for the 454. Back pressure was pretty high. So what do you do to cure back pressure on your big block? How about add two? And they only cost us 326 bucks for both. For this test, we decided to put a pair of these GT45 turbos, the GT45 knockoff turbos. These are available from DNA. Let me show you. I can show you the part number down here. They don't have any specs on it. I'll see if I can look those up and put those up on the screen. But that's they're the GT45 clones. Here's one. Here's the other one here. See, we're controlling our, got wastegates from TurboSmart. We got a pair of those, 45s, those work good. So I wanted to talk to you guys about the test motor because it's an important part of this test. Before we ran the motor, it's a Gen 6 454 that I got from the wrecking yard. It's a stock bottom end. All I did was take it apart and put ring gap on it. We put new head gaskets on it. It's got ARP head bolts in it right now that I'm going to put studs in before we put the big turbos on there. It's got a set of Dart Pro 1 aluminum heads. You can see the Dart Pro 1 there. It's got an Edelbrock single plane Victor Jr. intake designed to accept fuel injection. And we've got a single 4-hole throttle body from Holley, and all this is being controlled by a Holley HP management system. We've got 80-pound injectors in there, which as it turned out in this test were limiting us a little bit because we're running E85 on this. And when you get up into the 4-digit power level, it's tough to make with those 80-pound injectors, but I'll talk about that in the results. So we've got our test motor. We've got these headers on here. You see these are custom made by JFab. They're basically big block headers with V-bands on them. And then we made these elbows. He did that too. So we could mount the turbos. What I wanted to find out was we ran one of these before, and the problem is it'll only support maybe 800 horsepower, but on the big block it gets even tougher because the back pressure is so high on these things. They're small and they're not really sized for a big motor like that. They work well like on a 4.8 or a 5.3 if you want something that's in the 700 to 800 horsepower range. They actually work fairly well, but on the big block the back pressure was really, really high. So what we'll do is we're going to run two of them now. We'll compare the back pressure, we'll compare the boost pressure obviously, and then I've also got a test that I ran with a big single billet wheel S480 that might be interesting to throw that in the mix too. But right now all I want to do is talk about the single eBay GT45 run on this big block versus the twins. There they are. Let's get to the results. This is the power output of our naturally aspirated 454 Gen 6 from the junkyard, and we went over everything that's in that motor previously, so we'll jump right into the power output. It produced 510 horsepower and 488 foot-pounds of torque, 487.5, we're going to round up to 488. So this is what happened when we installed the single eBay GT45 turbo from DNA. Made a little over 700 horsepower. This fall off here was probably in the tuning. We could have added a little timing and had that be a lot smoother, but I didn't spend any time tuning this, and we'll find out why in just a second, because this turbo was just not sized correctly for this application. It was very responsive, but it had a falling boost curve. And the reason for, even though we had an electronic wastegate controller on this single turbo, it still had a falling boost curve. We needed to put much more wastegate spring in this thing to be able to control this because the back pressure was just so high with this. Sure, we made over 700 horsepower and the torque was way up, 756 foot-pounds. And this was at about 8.5 or 9 pounds out here. We'll take a look at the boost pressure curve in just a second compared to the back pressure curve, but it's not good with a single turbo. That little GT45 clone that everybody's selling, this one came from DNA, is not a bad turbo, but it's a much better turbo for a 4.8 or a 5.3 LS motor. So these are the power outputs that we made with the single turbo. Now let's take a look at and see what the boost pressure versus back pressure is. So let's take a look here. Grab our boost pressure, get rid of oil, grab our back pressure channel. Boom, we got that rolling. So now take a look at these two. It would be nice if these were the same or the boost pressure was actually above the back pressure, but that's not the case. This lower graph is the boost pressure, starts out at 9.1 pounds, falls down to 8.2 pounds. Not a big drop, you know, about 1 pound, but look what happens to the back pressure. Even starting out on the load in, the back pressure is 10.9 pounds and rises, doubles basically, rises to 22.5 psi of back pressure. So that's 22.5 pounds of back pressure with only 8.3 pounds of boost pressure. That's a pretty serious relationship. That's not something that you want. And that's why I said this turbo is a much better choice for, even at the 700 horsepower range, which it will make more than that. We've made as much as 800. It's a much better choice for a 4.8 or even a 5.3 LS, something smaller than this 454. That's why we finished up with this second test where we run the twins. This back pressure is absurd. You don't want to have back pressure like this. I mean, obviously the thing's very responsive, but you wouldn't want to run it for any length of time like this. Back pressure like that, you'd run into problems with maybe burning exhaust valves, and you run into detonation, all kinds of stuff. Back pressure is just not good. So a single GT45, not a good application for a Gen 4 or a 454 making 500 horsepower. But let's take a look at what happens when we ran twins. Now we can take a look at the power output. This is our Gen 6 454 again. We made 509 this time around because we had run it previously with a single turbo, and now we put twins on it. But as we always do before I run turbo stuff, I always like to run the motor NA just to make sure that it's still in good shape and that it repeats and it's not leaking oil, or at least not a lot of oil. I mean, it is a junkyard motor. It had ring gap in it though, so I think it was all good to run a bunch of boost on it. We ran our NA power, our NA motor again, made the same power, made a little bit more torque actually. We spent a little bit more time tuning it. So here's what happened with the twin turbos, the twin eBay GT45 turbos, at about 8.5 pounds, 8.8 pounds, kind of the same level that we ran the single turbo at. But you see in this case, it made a fair bit more power. 780 horsepower on this one, and 786 foot-pounds of torque. Now this is a good power output. The twins were working well, and as it turned out, we were able to turn this up quite a bit more than this. The twin turbos were obviously not limited the way that the single was, but the most important thing is obviously we could make the power, but how was the back pressure? So let's take a look at the back pressure offered now by the twin turbos. This was at the same boost level that we ran before. Remember, before on the single turbo, it had about 8 pounds of boost pressure and 22.5 pounds of back pressure. So let's see where we are with the twins. Bring this all up here. Amazing. So we have out at the peak 8.8 pounds of boost pressure. That's right, the top one is the boost pressure here, and the bottom one is the back pressure. We started out with back pressure down at just 3.6 psi of back pressure, and that rose to a whopping peak of 5.4 psi of back pressure. So back pressure never even reached boost pressure on this. So obviously putting twins on more than cut the boost pressure in half. It cut it down from 22.5 down to 5.4. So that's a pretty serious gain. Now that we've taken a look at the back pressure on the twin system and we've kind of compared it to the single, obviously we have a lot less. I mean, it went from 22.5 pounds at this boost level down to, you know, almost 5.5. So it only cut it by, what's that, 17 pounds of back pressure? That's quite a bit. Now let's take a look at what happened on the twin system when we ran. Obviously we didn't just run 8.8 pounds of boost because we were there to make a little bit more power than that. I kind of wanted to see, I had a 4-digit power number in mind, and that's what we went for. Let's find out what happened. Okay, we're back with our boost on our twin turbo big block 454. We got about 8.5 pounds. The thing's making 780 horsepower and 786 foot-pounds of torque. But obviously we didn't stop there, so we raised the boost. So let's go over here, go up in boost. It's 10 pounds, 10.1, 824, no problem. Obviously we didn't stop there, we had 4 digits, we had to get to 4 digits. Went up to 12.4 pounds, 885 horsepower and 895 foot-pounds of torque, just getting right near 900. So we cranked the boost up a little bit more. 15.4 pounds. 969.5 horsepower. And 984 foot-pounds, so we were getting near 1,000 foot-pounds of torque. And here's where we started running into trouble, actually. I only had 80-pound injectors in here, and I was running all this testing on E85. So we were getting up near the limit of those injectors. So what I had to do was increase the static pressure. We had plenty of fuel pump. We had an Aeromotive, one of their brushless pumps, so it's pretty pissed off. It's more than capable of supplying the fuel. So we had 58 pounds of static pressure in it. And at this boost level, we were looking at 23 degrees, I think. So, but we had more than a fuel pump in it. So what I did was turn the static pressure up from 58 PSI. I went all the way up to 68 PSI. And that gave us a little bit of wiggle room because on these runs where we were getting up near 1,000 horsepower, we had no more fuel delivery, and it would just, the air fuel would just skyrocket up to 12.5, 12.7. It would keep going if I allowed it, but obviously we'd lift off the throttle when that happened. So what I did was turn the fuel pressure up, and then I could go in and retune the stuff down below where I had fuel, and then we had enough fuel where it was getting lean. So we made the final run of the day just to get to our big number. 16.5 pounds, crested the 1,000 horsepower mark with 1,041 and well over 1,000 foot-pounds of torque, 1,028 foot-pounds of torque. Now there's certainly more power left in these GT45s. We know that each one of them will support at least 700 horsepower, and that was obviously with very high back pressure, and now that's fairly low. So I think on this application, that these eBay turbos might support 1,500 or 1,600 horsepower on the right combination. We didn't do that on this because, again, I ran out of fuel. And obviously, one other thing I wanted to mention is I topped out. I only had a 2-bar map sensor on here because I thought, well, we should be able to get there with a 2-bar map sensor. I always seem to make the mistake. Somebody needs to get me a 4 or 5-bar map sensor so I can just keep using the same one and I have to worry about this over and over again. But sometimes we got to deal with what we got. But we were able to make over 1,000 horsepower. That was the goal for this. That's a stock bottom end 454 with a ring gap on it. It's got heads and cam on it, but 1,000 horsepower, twin GT45s, they're working awesome. Now let's take a look at what happens. We'll compare this to a previous run I did with a single billet wheel S480 turbo, which is more than capable of supplying this power. Okay, there's a little bit more information I forgot to provide in the last little section there. And this, I'm sure you guys were going to ask, what was the boost pressure versus back pressure at the highest boost pressure that we ran at 16.5 pounds on the twin setup? On the twin setup, look at that, we had a nice flat boost curve. 16, got up as high as 16.5 pounds. The back pressure rose from a low of 5.7 pounds to a high of 10.6 psi back pressure, where we had 16 pounds of boost pressure. So the back pressure never reached the boost pressure. The boost pressure was always higher. It was nice and flat, slightly rising for the back pressure, which worked out great. It was a good combination. Those turbos were sized pretty well. The other thing I want you to take a look at is on this run. Let's take a look at the temperatures here. This is the charge temperature after our air-to-water intercooler. We were running dyno water. Got a slight rise from 82 at the beginning of the run up to a little over 100. 101 degrees going into the manifold after the intercooler, after the air-to-water intercooler. I didn't have temperature readings coming out of the turbo, unfortunately. We didn't have that. I didn't have two sensors working at the same time. But we got to figure at 16 psi, they've got to be, it's got to be way over 200 degrees. I'm thinking it's going to be in the 240 range or something like that. So those are the charge temperatures. Now let's take a look at a comparison that I ran. I ran this combination with a single S480 billet wheel turbo also. This was that run at, what was that? Yeah, 12.6 pounds, made 913, and the closest we have is like 12.3 or 12.4, I think, so a little less boost on the twin setup. So made a little bit less power with the twin setup than the single, but this is always a question. I mean, obviously a single eBay GT45 turbo versus a twin is a very easy thing. I mean, we know the twins are going to make more because the back pressure is so high, especially on a 454. But what about if you have the right size single, which that S480 is kind of sized perfectly for this application? It will support probably 1200 horsepower. So in this 900 horsepower range on the big block, it actually worked out pretty well. The numbers were very comparable. Maybe the single was a little bit better here again. I didn't run these on the same day and do it as a back-to-back. These are run on 2 different days. This is not exactly the same boost, but it's the same motor. And what my takeaway from this right here is that it's going to be very comparable. A lot of guys think, oh, the twin's better or the single's better. The reality is that if both turbos are sized so that they'll provide the power level that you need, they're both going to kind of do the same thing. And even those cheap eBay turbos seem to work fairly well here. The billet wheel did make more, although at a slightly higher boost pressure, 2 or 3/10 of a pound. But the power gain was, the difference was, you know, 20, what's that, 84, 16, 25, 30 horsepower. So that's quite a bit. So maybe the S480 is quite a bit better, even though at a slightly higher boost level. But here's another interesting thing. The single versus the twin, the thing you normally see is a fairly significant change in back pressure. The twins, we had low back pressure. Remember, we never even reached the same as the boost pressure. It was quite a bit under. On the single billet wheel S480, if we compare the boost pressure versus the back pressure, we have the back pressure was lower than the boost pressure on the load-in, but crossed over here at 3,900 RPM. And then on the single, with 12.6 PSI coming out of that S480 turbo, we had 19.6 pounds of back pressure. So again, a lot better than the single eBay GT45 turbo, but still not quite as good as twins on it, and that's normally what we see. Single usually has higher back pressure. Twins have less back pressure. So maybe ultimately you could make more with the twins if you have that lower back pressure. And this is why you also see guys want to put different camshafts in these things, because you have a big change in back pressure so that they want to cam that accordingly. Lots of good information here. Let's go really quickly to the conclusion and then we can say goodbye. Honestly, guys, we don't really even need a conclusion here. I mean, I went over everything in the results, but here's a quick rundown. Single versus twin eBay GT45s on a 454, definitely go with the twins. Unless all you want is like tons of low speed response, a single is probably too small. The twins work great, especially if you want to make a ton of power. You can also run a single eBay GT45 turbo or the DNA. A lot of guys sell it on a 4.8 or 5.3, works good. Twins also work good on those, whether it's a 4.8, 5.3, or a 6.0. A little bit better as a twin on a 5.3 or a 6.0, but you definitely can do it on a 4.8 and it'll make a lot of power. I think that these things will support probably, I don't know, maybe 1,500 horsepower or something like that on the right combination. That's another interesting test if I didn't run out of injector and map sensor again. But what about single versus twin, both that have comparable flow? Because a single versus a twin here, that's no contest. But what about a single versus a twin where you have good flow from either one? Now, I say that's a crapshoot. I mean, they both work. If you size them correctly, they're both going to do exactly what you want them to do. And that's what we found out when we compared the billet wheel S480 to the two GT45s. They both work. There's no absolute thing when it comes to single versus twin. The twins don't spool better, the single doesn't work better. We saw a little bit more back pressure with the single than we did with the twin. But honestly, it comes down to sizing. If you size the turbo right, whether it's a single or a twin, they both work. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. I got a lot more testing. Gotta bring you guys a bunch of stuff. Thanks for watching.